Picture the year 303. The Roman Empire is the most powerful system on earth, not only because of legions and swords, but because it's organized. Roads move soldiers fast. Taxes never stop. Courts write everything down. A government like this can reach into any town, any market, any apartment, any life. Now, zoom in on an ordinary family living in the shadow of that machine. A father who works with his hands and tries to keep food on the table. A mother who holds the household together. Children who fall asleep to the sound of carts rattling over stone streets and the distant noise of a city winding down. They are not plotting a rebellion. They are not hiding weapons. They are not trying to burn the empire down. But on paper, in the eyes of the state, they are criminals. Because in Rome, loyalty was not only political, it was spiritual. The empire ran on a simple idea. Public religion meant public order. You honored the gods, you honored the state, and you honored the emperor's authority. You didn't have to be passionate about it. You just had to participate publicly, so everyone could see you belong to the same system. And that is where the problem began. Christians refused one small act that carried enormous meaning. They would not treat the emperor as divine. They would not perform the public ritual that basically said, "This system is sacred and I submit to it." To a modern mind, that might sound like a private disagreement. To Rome, it sounded like disloyalty. It sounded like a threat. The crackdown did not begin with random mobs and chaos. It began the Roman way, with paperwork. Under Diocletian, the government launched what historians call the Great Persecution. This wasn't one angry outburst. It was policy, built into a bureaucratic machine designed to squeeze a faith out of existence. Edicts were issued and distributed like any other government order. Burn their books, destroy their meeting places, strip Christians, especially the wealthy and influential, of rank, legal protection, and property. Officials were expected to enforce it, document it, and prove they were doing their jobs. In a system like that, cruelty doesn't need passion, it only needs procedure. Imagine what that did to a neighborhood. One day, you greet your neighbor like always. The next day, his door is sealed, his furniture is being dragged out, and a stamped notice says the property is now under state control. The family is gone, and nobody is sure where. The city keeps moving, the marketplace keeps opening, and the empire keeps collecting taxes, as if nothing happened. That's what makes this persecution different from the way people usually picture it. It wasn't only violence, it was administration. The destruction of a community turned into routine, a list, a process. And once it becomes process, it spreads. And then, there was the incentive nobody likes to talk about. Persecution wasn't just ideological, it was profitable. If your neighbor was labeled a Christian, you could report him. If you had the right connections, you could end up with a portion of what was taken. Land could be seized, a shop could be reassigned, a house could be redistributed legally with official stamps and signatures that made theft look like governance. That created a poison atmosphere of suspicion. People started watching who visited whose home. They listened for whispers, for hymns, for anything that sounded different. Even silence became suspicious. If a family didn't show up to the public rites, someone noticed. If they didn't burn incense when expected, someone recorded it. And the most dangerous enemy wasn't always a soldier. Sometimes, it was the person living next door, trying to save themselves, or trying to gain something at your expense. So, this Christian family learned to live in fragments. They didn't gather openly, they didn't speak freely, they memorized what they could and hid what they couldn't. They met in small groups because large groups were easy to spot. They taught their children to be careful, not because they were ashamed, but because one careless sentence could end an entire household. And still, the empire saw them as a category, a problem to be managed, a disobedient minority that had to be corrected. or removed. That's the world before the edict, a world where being a Christian could make you a criminal without you ever committing a crime, a world where law didn't protect you, it hunted you, and where the most terrifying part wasn't the anger of a crowd, but the calm efficiency of paperwork that could erase you from society. By 303, the empire believed it could crush this movement with enough pressure. But what it was really doing was testing something deeper: how far people will go when they believe their conscience is worth more than their safety. And that pressure kept building. Because when a government turns persecution into a system, it doesn't just punish the guilty. It teaches everyone else a lesson. It teaches them to conform, to stay quiet, and to never be the one who stands out. But it also creates something the empire didn't expect. It creates people who become impossible to intimidate. And that is exactly why the story is about to turn. But the Roman machine, for all its cold efficiency, was starting to tear itself apart. By the year 306, the empire was no longer a unified force. The system of 4 rulers had collapsed into a bloody, chaotic struggle for power. The empire wasn't just hunting Christians anymore. It was hunting itself. Generals turned against generals. Armies that were supposed to guard the frontiers were now marching on Rome. And in the middle of this firestorm stood one man, Constantine. He wasn't a philosopher. He wasn't a religious scholar. He was a soldier, a man of the camps, a man of the legions. He had spent his life watching the gears of the empire turn. He had seen the great persecution firsthand, and he had noticed something that his predecessors had missed. He saw that the more the empire crushed the Christians, the stronger they became. You can burn a building, you can seize a field, but you cannot kill an idea with a sword. All the empire was doing was turning ordinary people into martyrs and victims into heroes. As Constantine marched toward Rome in the autumn of 312 to face his rival, Maxentius, the stakes were total. This wasn't just a battle for a throne. It was a battle for the future direction of the Western world. Then came the moment that passed into legend. The story tells us that as the sun began to set before the great battle, Constantine looked at the sky and saw a vision, a cross of light, and words that would change the course of history: in hoc signo vinces. In this sign, conquer. Now, we can debate the miracle, but we cannot debate the reality of what happened next. Constantine didn't just see a vision, he saw a strategy. He saw a way to unite a fractured people under a single powerful identity. He did something unthinkable. He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with a new symbol, the Chi, a symbol associated with the very faith the empire had spent a decade trying to erase. Imagine the tension in the ranks. These were soldiers who had carried out the edicts of destruction. Now, they were marching into the most important battle of their lives, under the banner of the persecuted. The two armies met at the Milvian Bridge, just outside the walls of Rome. It was a desperate, brutal fight. But Maxentius's forces broke. They were pushed into the river, and Constantine rode into the city as the undisputed master of the West. But as the dust settled, as the cheers of the crowd faded, Constantine looked at his city and saw a broken society. The jails were still full of, quote, two whose only crime was their faith. The titles to land and homes were still a mess of state-sanctioned theft. The laws that turned neighbors into spies were still on the books. Rome was a city of victors and victims, living side by side in a fragile, uneasy silence. Constantine knew that a military victory wasn't enough to save Rome. He didn't just need more soldiers. He needed a new law, a document that would do more than just stop the violence. He needed a document that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of the empire, and for that, he would have to travel north, to the city of Milan. In February of 313, the city of Milan was a place of celebration. Constantine, the ruler of the West, had come to meet Licinius, the ruler of the East. On the surface, it was a family affair, a high-stakes political wedding. Constantine was giving his half-sister in marriage to Licinius to cement a fragile alliance between the two halves of the Roman world. There were feasts, music, and the typical displays of Roman power. But behind the scenes, away from the banquet tables, the two most powerful men on earth were working on a single document. They weren't just discussing borders or taxes, they were addressing a crisis that had fractured the empire for years: the status of the Christians. The result of those meetings was not a grand speech or a massive book of laws. It was a letter, a simple, direct administrative order sent to the governors of the provinces. History knows it as the Edict of Milan. To understand how radical this document was, you have to look at what it didn't do. It didn't make Christianity the official religion. It didn't ban the old gods. Instead, it offered a concept that was almost unheard of in the ancient world: state-sanctioned tolerance. The text was clear. It stated that any one of these people who wishes to observe Christian religion may do so freely and openly, without any disturbance. It was a statement that the empire would no longer use its vast power to enforce religious conformity. The state was choosing peace over persecution. It was an acknowledgement that a stable empire needed its citizens to be at peace with their own beliefs, rather than living in constant fear of their own government. But Constantine and Licinius knew that words alone were cheap. You cannot talk about peace to a community whose assets were systematically stolen just a few years before. You cannot tell a man he is free if he is still looking at the ruins of his former life. This is where the Edict of Milan stopped being a letter and became a revolution. The document included a specific, mandatory clause about property. It didn't just suggest that Christians should get their things back, it ordered it. Any property, houses, gardens, meeting places that had been confiscated during the persecutions had to be returned immediately, without cost, and without delay. Even more significant was the directive for current owners. If you were a Roman citizen who had bought a confiscated Christian house from the government, you were now told to give it back. The emperors promised that the government would handle the compensation later, but the priority was clear. The original owners were to be restored to their homes first. As the messengers rode out of Milan, they carried more than just a letter. They carried a new rule book. They were heading to every corner of the empire, from the sun-drenched coast of Africa to the foggy hills of Britain, carrying a message that the era of state-led terror was finally over. To a local Roman official, the Edict of Milan was a massive shift in how the law worked. For years, the law had been a tool of pressure. If you were a Christian, the law didn't protect you, it hunted you. It was a system where your legal rights vanished the moment you refused to sacrifice to the state gods. But now, for the first time in a generation, the law was acting as a protector for this specific minority. By granting the right to worship to everyone, not just Christians, but every soul in the empire, Constantine and Licinius were stripping the local governors of their most powerful tool of intimidation. They were effectively dismantling the bureaucracy of state-sanctioned discrimination. The real impact, however, was in the details of the property returns. Think back to the neighbors or opportunistic businessmen who had profited from the purges. They had __0_ paperwork. They had bought houses, shops, and lands at government auctions, often for a fraction of their value. Under any normal Roman law, those sales would be final. But the Edict of Milan swept those conventions aside. It stated that these properties must be returned without any demand for payment. Imagine the tension in a local marketplace. A Christian walks up to his former shop, knocks on the door, and hands the current occupant a copy of the edict. There is no long trial. There is no debate. The law now said, in effect, (1) By promising to compensate the current owners from the imperial treasury, Constantine was shifting the financial burden of the persecution away from the victims and onto the state itself. He was removing the profit motive for religious hatred. He was making it clear that the government would no longer reward those who benefited from the suffering of others. And then, there was the legal status of the church as a community. Before 313, a Christian community was an _(2) entity. It couldn't legally hold property as a collective. If they had a meeting house, it had to be registered under a private name. If that person died or was arrested, the property was in legal limbo. The edict changed that. It allowed the church to hold property as a recognized group. This was the moment the church moved from the shadows of private homes into the light of the public square. It was no longer a scattered collection of secret societies. It was now a visible and permanent part of Roman society. The edict didn't just give people their houses back. It gave them a legal place to exist. It laid the foundation for a world where your identity wasn't something the state could simply take away through paperwork. But as the news spread, a new question began to haunt the streets of the great cities. The law had changed on the parchment, but could it change in the hearts of the people? After a decade of being told to hate and to spy, how do you go back to being neighbors? The paper revolution was over. Now, the human consequences were about to begin. When the messengers finally reached the cities of the East, Nicomedia, Antioch, Alexandria, the atmosphere changed almost overnight. Imagine being a prisoner in one of Rome's dark, overcrowded cells. You've spent years there, not for a crime, but for a belief. You've listened to the sounds of guards and chains, expecting every day to be your last. And then, the door opens. Not for an execution, but for a release. Historians of the time describe these scenes with incredible emotion. Thousands of people, many of them scarred or crippled from their time in captivity, walking out into the sunlight. They weren't just going home. They were being told that they were no longer enemies of the state. In the streets, the reaction was a mixture of joy and profound shock. For the Christians, it was a miracle they never expected to see in their lifetime. For the first time, they could gather in the light. They didn't have to whisper. They didn't have to meet in the shadows of private dining rooms or secret basements. But for the rest of Roman society, the pagans who had followed the old gods for 1,000 years, the Edict of Milan was a confusing and unsettling moment. For a decade, the government's propaganda had labeled Christians as a deadly superstition. People had been encouraged to view them as the cause of the empire's misfortunes. Now, the government was not only protecting them, but forcing people to return the property they had taken. The social tension was thick. Imagine the awkwardness in a neighborhood where a family returns to the house they were dragged out of 5 years ago. They see the person who has been living in their rooms, eating at their table, and sleeping under their roof. The edict could return the walls and the roof, but it couldn't instantly erase the memory of the betrayal. Yet, despite this tension, something remarkable began to happen. The Christians didn't emerge seeking bloody revenge. Because the edict provided a legal path for justice and restitution, it prevented a cycle of private violence. The law was doing the work that, in other ages, was done by the sword. And then, the construction began. For centuries, Christian churches were invisible. Now, with their property restored and their legal status secured, the landscape of the Roman city began to shift. Large public buildings, the first great basilicas, started to rise. The cross, once a hidden sign scratched into a wall, was now appearing on public monuments. The day after the edict was the first day of a new world. The Roman Empire was still there, its legions still marched, its taxes were still collected, but its heart had moved. The era of the catacombs was over. The era of the cathedral had begun. The Edict of Milan didn't just change where people prayed, it changed how the empire functioned. Before 313, if you walked through a Roman city like Corinth or Ephesus, the most magnificent buildings were always the temples of the old gods, Jupiter, Mars, or Venus. They were the symbols of state power. Christian worship, meanwhile, was tucked away in private villas or modest rooms in crowded apartment blocks. But after the edict, the skyline of the world began to change. With their property restored and their legal status secured, Christian communities began to build on a scale that was previously impossible. They didn't just build shrines, they built basilicas. These were massive public halls designed to hold thousands of people. For the first time, the illegal faith had a physical, undeniable presence in the center of the city. But the shift was deeper than just stone and marble. It was a shift in values. The church, now operating in the open, began to take on roles that the Roman state had often ignored. They organized massive systems of charity. They built hospitals and hostels. They created networks to feed the poor and care for widows and orphans, not as a private kindness, but as a public mission. Constantine saw the efficiency of this organization. He began to integrate the church into the fabric of the empire. Bishops, once hunted men, were now advisors to the court. The resources of the state began to flow toward Christian projects. However, this transition came with a new set of challenges. When the church was underground, it was united by the shared danger of persecution. Now that it was legal and increasingly powerful, it began to struggle with internal divisions. Without a common enemy in the Roman government, different groups within the faith began to argue over doctrine and leadership. For the first time, the emperors felt they had to step in to keep the peace between Christians themselves. The freedom granted in Milan had solved one problem, but it had opened the door to a new era of complex politics. Yet, despite these growing pains, the direction of history was set. The Roman Empire was no longer a machine designed to crush Christianity. It was becoming the vessel that would carry it across the world. The values that started in those small hidden groups, ideas about the sanctity of life, the equality of souls, and the duty to the poor, were now becoming the official language of the most powerful system on earth. When we look back at the year 313, it's easy to see it as just another date in a history book, a minor footnote in the long decline of the Roman Empire. But that would be a mistake. The Edict of Milan was the moment the world took a turn from which it would never go back. Think about what it truly represented. It was the first time a major power recognized that there are parts of a human being that the state does not own. It established the idea that a person's conscience, their deepest beliefs about the universe and their place in it, is off limits to the police, the tax collector, and the executioner. Before Milan, the law was about the power of the ruler. After Milan, the law began its long, slow journey toward the protection of the individual. We can still see the ripples of that document today. Every time a modern government protects the right of a minority to exist, every time a constitution guarantees the freedom of speech or belief, it is echoing the logic that Constantine and Licinius put on parchment 17 centuries ago. The edict didn't create a perfect world. It didn't end war, and it didn't stop future generations from finding new reasons to persecute one another. But it did plant a seed. It introduced the concept that peace is more productive than forced conformity. It proved that a society is stronger when its people are not forced to live double lives in the shadows. The story of the Edict of Milan is a reminder that the world doesn't always change through battles and fire. Sometimes, the most powerful thing on earth is a single page of text, a document that says, "Stop. Return what was taken. Let them be." That ordinary family we talked about at the beginning, the ones who fell asleep to the sound of carts on stone streets, wondering if the next knock on the door would be their last. Because of the edict, they could finally open their windows. They could speak their children's names without fear. They could walk into the sunlight, not as criminals, but as people who were finally, legally, home. The Roman Empire eventually fell. Its legions vanished, and its great palaces crumbled into dust. But the idea that was born in Milan survived. It outlived the emperors, it outlived the temples, and it became the foundation of the world we inhabit today. One document, one signature, one moment where the law stopped hunting and started to heal. History is shaped by stories like this. If you want to discover more moments that changed our world, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button.